Today, we're diving into one of the most incredible and honestly most forgotten stories in American history, the Creole Mutiny. Now, this isn't just another tale of rebellion. This is the story of the single most successful slave revolt this nation has ever seen.
Okay, just picture this. It's November 1841 in Nassau Harbor, in the Bahamas. A letter lands on the governor's desk, and the words practically tremble on the page, describing the scene of absolute horror. An American ship, the Creole, has just pulled into port, and it's a floating bloodbath. And that one shocking image, it was about to ignite an international firestorm.
So that's the big question, right? How does a ship that's supposed to be carrying tobacco and human cargo end up as a scene of carnage and ultimately liberation in a foreign port? That's the mystery we're going to unravel today. What in the world happened on those dark nights out on the Atlantic?
So the ship's arrival immediately kicks off this huge diplomatic crisis between the United States and Great Britain. But, to really get what's happening in Nassau, we have to rewind. We have to go back to the beginning to see how this voyage of pure oppression somehow turned into a vessel of revolution.
To get the Creole, you really have to get the system it was a part of. See, after the U.S. banned the import of slaves in 1808, the trade didn't stop, not at all. It just moved inside the country. This coastal slave trade was a brutal, massive industry, basically shipping people from states like Virginia down to the booming cotton and sugar plantations around New Orleans. And the 135 souls trapped in the Creole's hold, they were just cogs in this massive, dehumanizing machine.
Yeah, the 1840s were anything but quiet. The air was just thick with talk of rebellion and a whole lot of paranoia. Nat Turner's Revolt a decade earlier had sent these shockwaves of pure terror through the American South. And then you had rebellions in the British colonies, like Sam Sharp's, showing what was possible. And hey, the Amistad case? That was fresh in everyone's mind. A recent, spectacular, and very public success. This was the world the Creole was sailing into. A ship packed with desperate people on a climate like that, it's a powder keg just waiting for a spark. And aboard the Creole, well, there were several men who were more than ready to provide that spark. So let's meet the key players who turned this slave ship into a freedom vessel. At the very heart of this story is a man named Madison Washington. And what makes his story so incredibly powerful is that he wasn't a man who only dreamed of freedom. He had lived it. He had actually escaped slavery once, made it all the way to Canada, only to be recaptured when he went back to try and free his wife. So for him, this wasn't some abstract idea. It was a burning personal memory of what had been stolen from him. But Washington wasn't working alone. No way. He found allies, and each one brought something critical to the table. You had Elijah Morris, who brought this fierce determination. Doc Ruffin had medical knowledge, which, as you can imagine, would prove to be vital. And then there was Ben Blacksmith. He was the strategist. He actually knew about other ships that had ended up in British territory where the captives had been set free. He knew there was a path to liberation.
So you've got the leaders, you've got the beginnings of a plan, and you've got all the motivation in the world. Now let's get to the night that everything just exploded. The night the 135 captives decided they were willing to pay freedom's violent price.
Now, this was no spontaneous riot. Not at all. This thing was a meticulously planned operation. Washington had been made a cook, which gave him access to the whole ship. He watched the crew's schedules, he figured out their weaknesses, and he secretly recruited this core group of 18 rebels. They hid improvised weapons, kitchen knives, iron bars, anything they could find, and they just waited for the perfect moment, a storm that would distract the crew and give them cover. And that moment came on the night of November 7th. At 9 o'clock at night, right in the middle of a crew shift change, the ship was at its most vulnerable. Under the cover of darkness, with the sea rocking the boat, Washington and his 18 men slipped out from the shadows and put their desperate plan into motion.
The attack was incredibly swift and absolutely brutal. The first officer, a guy named Gifford, was struck down before he could even raise the alarm. The slave trader John R. Hulley, who was known for his cruelty, was confronted by Madison Washington himself. Hulley managed to fire a pistol and missed. That was the last thing he ever did. Washington's knife found its mark, and the first oppressor fell.
It was immediate chaos. The captain, Ensor, rushed out of his cabin only to be met by Elijah Morris, who stabbed him severely. Now Ensor would survive, but he'd be permanently disabled. The rest of the crew, they were terrified, totally overwhelmed, and they just scrambled up into the ship's rigging, hiding in the masts. In just a matter of minutes, the rebels had complete control of the deck.
And this right here is where Washington's genius as a leader just shines through. He finds William Merritt, one of the supervisors, who knows how to navigate. In the middle of all this blood-shedding chaos,
Washington is just ice cold. He delivers this chilling ultimatum. There was no negotiation. This ship was no longer headed to the slave markets of New Orleans. It was headed to freedom.
So, the rebels have the ship, but, seizing control, that was only half the battle. Now came the real test. Let's fast forward to their arrival in Nassau and see how this one act of rebellion on the high seas sparked an international showdown.
So you have this fundamental clash of laws. The American consul in Nassau is demanding the return of his nation's property, and he means both the ship and the people, and he wants the leaders tried for murder and piracy. But British law was crystal clear. Slavery was abolished in their empire. Anyone, enslaved or not, who set foot on British soil was instantly a free person. So you've got two empires with two completely irreconcilable ideas about what it means to be human, and they're about to collide.
Now here's a crucial part of the story. The people from the Creole were not alone. The black community of Nassau, many of whom were formerly enslaved themselves, they rose up in solidarity. They surrounded the Creole in hundreds of small boats, armed with things like clubs and harpoons, basically forming a protective barrier. They were not about to let their brothers and sisters be dragged back into bondage.
Well, the standoff in the harbor couldn't last forever. The actions of these 19 men, plus the incredible solidarity of the Bahamian people, were about to send shockwaves all the way across the Atlantic, shaking the very foundations of the American slave empire.
After months sitting in a Nassau prison, the verdict finally came down, and it was stunning. The British court declared that the 17 surviving leaders were not pirates or murderers. They had, and this is a direct quote, exercised their revolutionary right to freedom. The British government essentially ruled that the uprising wasn't a crime. It was a justifiable act of self-liberation.
So what happened to them all? Well, the 130 people who got off the ship found new lives in the Bahamas. Elijah Morris actually became a successful farmer. But tragically, 5 people chose to stay on the ship, and they were taken to New Orleans and sold right back into slavery. And Madison Washington, the brilliant, daring leader, he simply walked out of that prison and vanished from the pages of history. His final fate is a complete mystery.
The story doesn't quite end there, though. For years and years, the U.S. government kept demanding compensation for its citizens' lost property. Finally, over a decade later, in 1855, an international commission made a decision. Britain was ordered to pay the United States a staggering sum, $110,330.
And this is the grim irony of the whole Creole affair. While the rebels won their physical freedom, you could argue the U.S. won a different kind of victory. That payment legally validated the American claim that these 130 human beings were property with a specific dollar value, effectively putting an official price tag on their stolen freedom.
But the real legacy of the Creole can't be measured in dollars. It absolutely electrified the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass immortalized Madison Washington in his book, The Heroic Slave, creating this new kind of black hero for the cause, not a patient victim, but a revolutionary. In response, the slaveholding South, terrified of another Creole, clamped down with even more brutal security. This effect just drew a sharp line in the sand, deepening that chasm between North and South and pushing the nation ever closer to civil war. And above all, it stood as this powerful, undeniable symbol that resistance wasn't just possible, it could actually succeed. And that really brings us to the core of this story, and a really uncomfortable question. The men who led the Creole Revolt weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They were revolutionaries who were forged in an incredibly violent system. And their story kind of leaves us to wonder, when a system is built on such profound brutality that it denies people their very humanity, is violence maybe the only path to liberation? The only language it truly understands?